The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the rooftop terrace, where Silicon Valley's elite mingled with champagne flutes and carefully curated laughter. I stood near the bar, nursing a whiskey, watching my wife navigate the crowd with the grace that had first captivated me 7 years ago. She was in her element here, brilliant, charismatic, discussing her tech startup with potential investors and partners. "There's my beautiful partner," a voice boomed across the terrace. Derek Walsh strode toward us, all teeth and cologne, his hand already reaching for my wife's elbow. He was her new business partner, brought on 6 months ago to handle the aggressive growth phase of her company. Everything about him screamed new money: the Rolex that caught the light a bit too perfectly, the suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the confidence that came from never being told no. "Sarah, you look absolutely stunning," he said, completely ignoring my presence. "That dress is dangerous." My wife smiled politely, stepping slightly closer to me. "Derek, you remember my husband?" His eyes flicked to me for a millisecond, the way you might glance at a piece of furniture. "Right, yeah. What is it you do again?" He snapped his fingers as if trying to recall. "Teacher? Professor? Research analyst," I said evenly. Right. He laughed, a sharp bark that made several people turn. "The number cruncher. Sarah mentioned that." He turned back to her, physically angling his body to exclude me. "Anyway, we need to talk about the Melbourne deal." "I think we should." For the next 20 minutes, I stood there like a potted plant while Derek dominated the conversation. Every time I tried to contribute, he would talk over me or pivot back to Sarah. When I mentioned understanding market volatility, he actually patted my shoulder. "That's cute," he said, grinning at the small crowd that had gathered. "He understands volatility. That's like, what, reading graphs? Sarah, does he help you with your Excel spreadsheets?" Laughter rippled through the group. My wife's face tightened, but before she could speak, Derek was already launching into another story. "You know what real pressure is," he announced, addressing everyone except me. "It's closing a $12 million deal while the investors are literally walking out the door. It's making calls from Tokyo at 3 a.m. to save a partnership. That's real work." He glanced at me with mock sympathy. "No offense to the research guys, but analyzing data someone else collected? That's not exactly building empires." My jaw clenched, but I said nothing. My wife touched my arm gently, her eyes apologetic. I gave her a small smile and excused myself to get another drink. At the bar, I could still hear Derek's voice carrying across the terrace. "Sarah, seriously, you need someone who understands your world. The long nights, the risk-taking, the vision." The implication hung in the air like smoke. An older gentleman next to me at the bar shook his head. "That guy's a real piece of work." "You know him?" I asked. "Know of him. Derek Walsh. He's made a career of attaching himself to promising startups, taking credit for other people's work, and jumping ship right before things get complicated. He's got more red flags than a Chinese parade." I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my drink. The party continued around me, but I'd stopped participating. I watched Derek work the room, his hand lingering too long on my wife's lower back, his laugh too loud, his presence too invasive. At one point, he gathered a group of men near the edge of the terrace. "See that guy over there?" I heard him say, gesturing toward me. "That's Sarah's husband. Great guy, apparently, but can you imagine? She's building a $50 million company, and she goes home to someone who—" He lowered his voice, but the cruel laughter that followed told me everything I needed to know. My wife found me shortly after. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "He's been drinking. He's not usually this bad." "It's fine, elite." But it wasn't fine. And tomorrow morning, Derek Walsh was going to learn exactly who he'd been mocking all night. I woke at 5:30 a.m., as I did every morning. My wife was still asleep, her face peaceful against the pillow, unaware of the storm that had been brewing in my mind since we'd left the party. I kissed her forehead gently and headed to my home office. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of my computer booting up. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat down, pulling up the files I'd been reviewing all week. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek Walsh had spent last night mocking my work while having no idea what that work actually entailed. I was a senior investment analyst for Meridian Capital Group, one of the largest venture capital firms in the country. But that title didn't capture the reality of my position. I was the lead analyst on the due diligence team, the person who decided whether companies lived or died. My reports determined if hundreds of millions of dollars flowed to a startup or if their dreams dried up overnight. For the past 3 weeks, I'd been conducting a comprehensive review of a Series C funding request. The company was seeking $85 million to expand into Asian markets. It was a solid company with good fundamentals, innovative technology, and strong leadership. The founders had impressed me during our initial meetings. They were humble, detail-oriented, and realistic about challenges. But they'd recently brought on a new VP of Business Development to lead the international expansion. According to the files in front of me, this VP would be crucial to the success of the entire venture. The funding was contingent on having the right leadership in place. That VP was Derek Walsh. I hadn't made the connection immediately. Walsh was a common enough name, and the company, NextGen Analytics, wasn't one my wife had mentioned in detail. It wasn't until I'd been standing at that party, watching Derek pour at my wife and mock my career, that the pieces had clicked into place. Now, in the quiet of my office, I opened Derek's file. His resume was impressive on the surface: MIT graduate, VP positions at 3 different startups, involvement in several successful exits. But I'd learned long ago that resumes told you what people wanted you to know. Due diligence meant finding out everything else. I started with the basics: employment verification, reference checks, financial background. What I found made me lean back in my chair, coffee forgotten. Derek's involvement in those successful exits was peripheral at best. At his first company, he'd been VP of Business Development for 7 months before the company was acquired, but the acquisition had been in the works for 2 years before he arrived. He'd had nothing to do with it but had taken full credit in his subsequent interviews. At his second company, he'd lasted 11 months before being transitioned to a consulting role, corporate speak for being pushed out. I found an email thread from a former colleague, part of our background research, that described Derek as more interested in appearances than outcomes, and difficult to work with on cross-functional teams. His third company had indeed gone public, but Derek had left 6 months before the IPO. The official story was that he'd pursued other opportunities. A confidential conversation with one of the board members revealed a different story. Derek had been asked to leave after concerns about expense account abuse and inappropriate behavior toward female staff members. Then there was last night. I pulled up the photos from the party. It had been a semi-public event, and several people had posted on social media. There was Derek, drink in hand, his body language aggressive and invasive. There was my wife, leaning away from him, discomfort clear on her face. There was me, standing alone at the bar, while Derek entertained a crowd at my expense. My phone buzzed. A text from my wife. "Are you okay? You've been quiet since the party." I texted back, "I'm fine. Early meeting. Love you." Another buzz, this time from my colleague James, board meeting at 9 a.m. "They want your preliminary report on NextGen. Are we green-lighting this?" I stared at that message for a long moment. This wasn't about revenge. If Derek had been the right person for the job, if his track record had been solid, if his references had checked out, if his behavior had been professional, then my personal feelings wouldn't have mattered. I'd recommended funding for companies led by people I didn't particularly like, because my job wasn't about my feelings. It was about protecting our investors' money and ensuring the success of our portfolio companies. But Derek Walsh wasn't the right person. His track record was smoke and mirrors. His references were carefully curated lies. And his behavior, not just toward me, but toward my wife, toward women in general, was a liability waiting to explode. NextGen Analytics deserved better. Our investors deserved better. I began typing my report. The conference room at Meridian Capital Group was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown San Francisco, the morning fog still clinging to the tops of the skyscrapers. 8 senior partners sat around the black marble table, along with 3 other analysts. Combined, the people in this room controlled over $15 billion in investment capital. I stood at the head of the table, my presentation displayed on the massive screen behind me. I'd been doing this for 6 years, but my heart still raced every time. Not from nerves, from the weight of responsibility. My words would determine the fate of companies, the livelihoods of employees, the returns for pension funds and university endowments. Good morning, I began. I'm here to present my findings on Next-Gen Analytics Series C funding request. David Chen, the managing partner, nodded. We've reviewed your preliminary notes. The technology is sound, the market opportunity is substantial, and the founding team is strong. This should be straightforward. What's your recommendation? I clicked to the next slide. I'm recommending we decline the investment at this time. The room went silent. Jennifer Park, another senior partner, leaned forward. Decline? Can you walk us through your reasoning? The company itself is solid, I said, advancing the slides. Revenue growth is consistent, customer retention is above industry average, and their technology represents a genuine advancement in predictive analytics. The Asian market expansion makes strategic sense. However, my concerns center on the leadership team assembled to execute this expansion. I pulled up Derek's file. Specifically, Derek Walsh, the VP of Business Development who would be leading the international push. On paper, he's impressive. In reality, there are significant red flags. For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through my findings. I showed them the discrepancies in his resume. I played them snippets from my confidential interviews with his former colleagues, carefully anonymized, as promised, but damning nonetheless. I presented the pattern of short tenures and mysterious departures. But here's what concerns me most, I said, pulling up financial records. In his role at his previous company, Walsh had discretionary authority over a $3 million business development budget. Our forensic accounting review found irregularities, excessive entertainment expenses, unclear vendor relationships, and several payments to consulting firms that don't appear to have delivered any actual services. Thomas O'Brien, our chief legal counsel, sat up straighter. Are we talking about fraud? We're talking about questionable judgment at minimum, I said carefully. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger formal investigations, and Walsh was gone before anyone looked too closely. But if we fund Next-Gen with him in this leadership role, we're giving him access to tens of millions of dollars in expansion capital. Based on his track record, that's an unacceptable risk. I clicked to the next slide, and my stomach tightened slightly. This part was personal, but it was also relevant. There's also a pattern of inappropriate workplace behavior. I've documented 3 separate incidents at his previous companies involving complaints about unprofessional conduct toward female colleagues. Nothing that resulted in formal action, but a consistent pattern of making people uncomfortable. David looked at me over his reading glasses. Do you have documentation? HR records from 2 companies, obtained with appropriate permissions during our due diligence. Both companies had Walsh sign separation agreements that included non-disparagement clauses, which should tell you something about their concerns. I took a breath. Last night, I attended an industry event where Walsh was present. He spent the evening making inappropriate comments to his current business partner, including physical contact that made her visibly uncomfortable. Multiple witnesses observed this behavior. I didn't mention that the business partner was my wife. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Jennifer pulled up something on her tablet. I see here that you've had some interaction with Next-Gen's partner company. Should we be concerned about a conflict of interest? I disclosed that connection in my preliminary notes, I said. My wife's company has a strategic partnership with Next-Gen, but no financial relationship. I've run this analysis past our ethics committee, and they've cleared it. However, if the board feels another analyst should review my findings, I understand. David shook his head. Your work has always been thorough and objective. If you say there's a problem, there's a problem. He looked around the table. Questions? Thomas spoke up. What if Next-Gen replaced Walsh? Would that change your recommendation? Completely, I said. The company is otherwise sound. With different leadership on the expansion, this would be a strong investment. I've actually identified 2 potential candidates who would be excellent in that role. Both have successful track records in Asian market entry, strong references, and clean backgrounds. David nodded slowly. Here's what we'll do. We'll table the funding decision for 30 days. Someone needs to have a conversation with NextGen's CEO about our concerns regarding Walsh. If they're willing to make a change, we can move forward. If not, he shrugged. I'll make the call, Jennifer said. I have an existing relationship with their CEO. I'll frame it as due diligence concerns without going into excessive detail. As the meeting broke up, David pulled me aside. That was good work. I know these decisions aren't easy, especially when there's any kind of personal connection. It's not personal, I said quietly. It's about protecting our investors and ensuring the companies we fund have the best chance of success. But as I walked back to my office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. This is Derek Walsh. I stared at the text message for a long moment before responding. I'm not sure what we'd need to discuss. 3 dots appeared immediately, then, don't play games. I know what you did. Meet me at Tanner's Coffee in 1 hour. I could have ignored it. I probably should have. But there was something almost satisfying about the desperation in his message. I texted back, I'll be there. Tanner's Coffee was a quiet spot in the financial district, the kind of place where deals were made and broken over expensive espresso. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, positioning myself where I could see the entrance. Derek burst through the door exactly on time, his usual polish cracked at the edges. His tie was loosened, his hair less perfectly styled than it had been at the party. He spotted me and crossed the cafe in quick strides, dropping into the chair across from me with enough force to rattle the table. You sabotaged me, he said without preamble. His voice was low but shaking with anger. You tanked my deal. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't. He jabbed a finger at me. Jennifer Park called our CEO this morning. Very apologetic, very professional, but the message was clear. Meridian has concerns about key personnel in the expansion team. That's code. They ran a background check, and someone fed them garbage about my track record. If Meridian did their due diligence and found concerns, that's between them and NextGen, I said calmly. You're the analyst on this deal. I saw the guest list for the board meeting this morning. You presented the findings. His eyes were wild now. This is because of the party. Because you got your feelings hurt. I set down my coffee cup carefully. What happened at the party? What? He blinked, thrown by the question. Tell me what you did at the party, I said. Walk me through it. Derek's jaw clenched. I had a few drinks. I networked. I talked business with Sarah. That's what these events are for. You mocked my career in front of a dozen people. You made inappropriate comments about my wife's appearance. You physically excluded me from conversations and implied she'd be better off with someone else. I kept my voice level. You spent the entire evening making it clear that you had no respect for me, my work, or my marriage. It was just party talk, he said, but something in his eyes flickered. Everyone does it. It didn't mean anything. Here's what you didn't know, I said, leaning forward. That number cruncher you were mocking? I'm the senior analyst at Meridian Capital. When you were laughing about how I just read graphs, I was 3 weeks into a comprehensive review of your company's funding request. And when you were suggesting my wife needs a real man, I was looking at your employment history, your financial records, and your track record of burning bridges. The color drained from Derek's face. The decision to recommend against funding wasn't personal, I continued. It was based on objective analysis. Your resume is padded with exaggerations. Your employment history shows a pattern of short tenures and unexplained departures. Your expense reports at your previous company raised red flags. And there's documented evidence of inappropriate workplace behavior toward female colleagues. That's not. Those complaints were nothing. Misunderstandings. 3 separate companies. 3 separate HR files. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is the report I presented this morning. Read it. Derek's hands shook as he opened the folder. I watched his eyes scan the pages, saw the moment he realized how thoroughly I'd documented everything. But the party, he said weakly. You're doing this because of what I said. If you'd been the right person for the job, if your track record had been solid, if your references had been strong, if you'd shown genuine leadership capability, I would have recommended the funding despite what happened at the party. My job is to protect investors and ensure portfolio success, not to settle personal scores. I paused. But you're not the right person. You're a liability. And what I saw at the party just confirmed what the data was already telling me. Derek slumped back in his chair. This will kill the deal. Without Meridian's funding, NextGen can't execute the expansion. The board will blame me. I'll be out. Meridian gave NextGen 30 days to address personnel concerns, I said. If you step aside gracefully, if you let them bring in someone qualified, the funding will go through. The company survives. The employees keep their jobs. Everyone wins except your ego. And if I don't? Then the deal dies, and your reputation in this industry dies with it. Because if NextGen tries to shop this funding request to other VCs, they'll all run the same due diligence. They'll all find the same red flags. And they'll all ask why NextGen's leadership ignored obvious warning signs. I stood up. Your choice. I was halfway to the door when Derek called out, I'm sorry. About the party. About Sarah. About everything. I turned back. He looked smaller now, deflated. Just another guy who'd mistaken arrogance for confidence and discovered the difference too late. You should apologize to my wife, I said. Not because it'll change anything professionally, but because it's the right thing to do. I left him sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of his own inadequacy. 2 weeks later, I sat in my home office reviewing quarterly reports when my wife knocked on the door. She leaned against the doorframe, holding 2 glasses of wine, a strange expression on her face. Derek resigned today, she said, handing me a glass. I heard, I replied carefully. We'd had pieces of this conversation over the past weeks, but never the full picture. I'd told her about the Meridian review, about the due diligence findings, about the decision to pause funding. She'd been shocked, then thoughtful, then quietly relieved. She sat down across from me. He sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, apologizing for his behavior at the party and admitting he'd been inappropriate in our working relationship. She took a sip of wine. He said you made him realize he'd become someone he didn't recognize. That's generous of him. Is it true, she asked, that you didn't tank the deal because of what he did to us? I met her eyes. Every word in my report was factually accurate and professionally relevant. Derek Walsh wasn't qualified for the role NextGen needed him to fill. His track record was thin, his judgment was questionable, and his behavior toward colleagues was problematic. Those facts existed before the party. But would you have looked as hard if he hadn't humiliated you? It was a fair question. Maybe not, I admitted. Maybe I would have done a surface-level review, seen the polished resume, and given him the benefit of the doubt. But that would have been a failure on my part. Due diligence means digging deep, not accepting things at face value. Derek's behavior at the party didn't create the problems. It just made me look close enough to find them. She nodded slowly. NextGen's CEO called me today too. They're bringing in someone else to lead the expansion. Someone with actual experience in Asian markets, not just buzzwords and bravado. She asked if we'd be interested in expanding our partnership with the new leadership. What did you say? I said yes. Because the partnership was always good business. It was just Derek who was the problem. She paused. She also told me that Meridian's funding came through. Full amount, better terms than the original proposal. Apparently your firm was impressed with how quickly and professionally NextGen addressed the personnel concerns. Good, I said, and meant it. They're a solid company with real potential. They deserve the chance to succeed. My wife studied me for a long moment. You know what I realized? I've been telling people for years that you're a research analyst, and I don't think I ever really understood what that meant. I thought you just looked at numbers all day. Sometimes I do just look at numbers all day, I said with a small smile. But it's more than that, isn't it? You're making decisions that affect hundreds of people. Companies live or die based on your recommendations. You're carrying that weight every single day, and you never talk about it. It's my job, I said simply. Just like building your company is yours. She set down her wine glass and came around the desk, wrapping her arms around my shoulders from behind. I'm sorry I didn't defend you more at the party. I should have shut Derek down the moment he started. You were in an impossible position. He was your business partner. You were trying to keep things professional. He was never really my partner, she said quietly. He was someone I hired because his resume looked good and he said all the right things. I didn't look deeper. I didn't do my own due diligence. She kissed the top of my head. I won't make that mistake again. 3 months later, I attended another industry party, different venue, different crowd, but the same underlying dynamics of ambition and networking and carefully cultivated images. My wife was across the room, deep in conversation with NextGen's new VP of International Development, a sharp woman named Victoria who'd successfully launched 3 companies into Asian markets. They were laughing about something, and I could see the difference in my wife's body language. Relaxed. Engaged. No defensive lean away, no forced smiles. You're the guy who killed the Walsh deal. I turned to find a man in his 50s, grey hair, expensive but understated suit. He extended a hand. Richard Morrison, Morrison Ventures. We were looking at NextGen about a year ago, before Meridian got involved. Walsh gave us the same song and dance, big promises, bigger ego. We passed. Heard through the grapevine that you're the one who actually did the homework. Just doing my job, I said, shaking his hand. Best kind of job, he said. Keeping the charlatans from stealing investor money and destroying good companies. We need more analysts willing to make the hard calls. He handed me a business card. We're always looking for people with integrity and judgment. If you ever get tired of Meridian, give me a call. I pocketed the card politely, though I had no intention of leaving. But it was good to be seen. Good to be recognized not as Sarah's husband, not as the quiet guy at the bar, but as someone who did important work and did it well. Derek Walsh messaged me once more, about 2 months after his resignation. Just 3 words, you were right. I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. The story could have been about revenge, the humiliated husband destroying the man who mocked him. But that wasn't what happened. The story was really about the difference between appearance and substance, between the person who talks loudest and the person who does the work that matters. Derek had built his career on polish and charm, on taking credit and avoiding scrutiny. It had worked for years, right up until someone actually looked beneath the surface. I'd built mine on thoroughness, on asking hard questions and following the evidence wherever it led. It wasn't flashy. Nobody would make a movie about a research analyst reviewing employment records and expense reports. But in the quiet spaces where real decisions were made, that work mattered more than all of Derek's networking and bluster combined. My wife found me near the end of the party, ready to go home. More than ready, I said. As we walked to our car, she squeezed my hand. You know what I love about you. My devastating good looks and sparkling wit. She laughed. That too. But mostly that you don't need to be the loudest person in the room to be the most important one. I thought about Derek, about his desperate need to be seen and admired and feared. About how he'd confused volume with value, presence with power. Someone once told me, I said, that real strength doesn't announce itself. It just does the work. My wife smiled. Smart person. She has her moments. We drove home through the city lights, past the towers where deals were made and broken, where futures hung in the balance of reports and recommendations and due diligence. Somewhere out there, Derek Walsh was rebuilding his life, hopefully with more honesty and less arrogance. Somewhere else, Next-gen analytics was expanding into new markets with capable leadership. And I would be back at my desk Monday morning, reviewing the next company, asking the next hard questions, making the next hard decisions. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because someone had to do the work that kept the whole system honest. That was enough.